Hi there, welcome everyone. I'm going to give everyone a second here just to get connected. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. As everyone's getting into the Zoom here, if you want to let us know in the chat where you're joining us from, that'd be great. I'm Michaela Schmidt. I'm an outreach coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. If you haven't joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Our mission is to champion the power of stories to make complex issues relevant and inspire action. The Pulitzer Center covers some of the biggest challenges facing the world today, from the environment and global health to human rights, peace and conflict, and artificial intelligence. Financial transparency, governance, gender, racial, and social justice issues are all important cross-cutting themes in all of these topics that we cover. Last year, we supported around 200 reporting projects in collaboration with journalists, filmmakers, and news outlets around the world. We believe that people and communities who actively engage with systemic challenges will find solutions together. By combining breakthrough journalism with strong audience engagement in communities and classrooms, we extend the impact of journalism, cultivate public awareness, and build community empowerment. If you're curious to learn a little bit more about our work, we'll share a link to our 2024 annual report in the chat. Just a few logistics before we kick off our event tonight. This evening is going to be split into 3 parts. First, we'll hear from our panelists, and they're going to introduce us to their work and their background, and then we'll transition into breakout rooms. It looks like we have a good mix of educators, clinicians, and journalists among us here tonight, so we're excited to get some of you guys moving and chatting with each other. And then finally, we're going to come back all together to share some takeaways and wrap it up with a Q&A here with our panelists at the end. Throughout all of this, the chat will be open for you to begin adding your questions for our speakers and each other. Live transcription is also available to be turned on with the captions icon at the bottom of your screen. We want to let you know that we are recording the main room and we will post it online at a later date. That said, the breakout rooms are not recordable, so you'll want to make sure to share any of your big takeaways in the main room at the end when we're asking for reflections. And then one final note, we'd really appreciate if you can stay for just a quick second once the session ends to participate in a brief survey and let us know your thoughts. So now, without any further ado, I'm happy to introduce our panelists for this evening's webinar, Unburdening the Climate Generation, Supporting Those Born into Crisis and Building Solutions. The Climate Psychology Alliance of North America's co-executive director, Rebecca Weston, is a psychotherapist, photographer, and activist living in Metro New York. In her clinical practice, Weston's work is informed by the recognition that our senses of self, connection, and capacity are powerfully influenced by both internal and systemic aspects of our lives. She has expertise in attachment and trauma. Grace Gibson Snyder is joining us from where she's currently based in DC. Grace is a Yale College student and plaintiff in the landmark youth-led constitutional climate case held versus the state of Montana. We also have Stephanie Haynes, who coordinates environmental coverage at the Christian Science Monitor, where she is the lead climate writer. She has worked as a journalist for 2 decades, both in the US and abroad. She is a multiple-time grant recipient from the Pulitzer Center and holds teaching positions at Yale University School of the Environment and the College of William and Mary. So thanks so much for joining us tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie now to get us started.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit of a project that I worked on with the Pulitzer Center in recent years called The Climate Generation. And first off, just for some groundwork, for those of you who aren't familiar with my news organization, The Monitor is an award-winning international publication. And we were founded more than 100 years ago to be a model of excellent journalism. And although we tend to focus on solutions and hopes, those things that connect people and places, we are clear-sighted about challenges. And so that's what underlay this story that we started working on a couple years ago. And I was talking with a colleague of mine named Sarah Yana about this paradox we had noticed. Over the past decades, the world's youngest people have made incredible gains in a slew of human rights categories, but at the same time, they're facing this unprecedented challenge. This cohort born since 1989 are going to experience a fundamentally different climate than what older people have lived through. And so a lot of the writing about young people and climate change has been focused on doom and gloom, but we were really interested in how young people were using this unprecedented generational agency to face this unprecedented challenge. And so we traveled around the world. We went to the Arctic, we went to Bangladesh, to Portugal, to Namibia. And we had this goal of trying to take a somewhat different look at what it meant to be in what we're calling the climate generation. And we had a lot of takeaways, but there's some that I think are particularly important in light of what we're going to be talking about here today. And overall, it was really clear to us that climate change is transformative. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution as this change that transformed not just manufacturing, but also the way that we understand time and family and what we eat and what to expect from life, climate change is doing the same. It's really this cultural and mindset and economic revolution. And that's true even if people involved in that transformation aren't necessarily connecting it explicitly to climate. And so here are some things that we found. Climate resilience is taking place in a lot of ways, and it's not just about activism. It's spurring innovation and decisions about what fields people go into. Here in Barbados, we saw a slew of young people getting involved in the clean energy economy and coming up with new ways to find locally specific ecosystem unique solutions for carbon emission. Here, they're developing a new biofuel to decarbonize the transportation sector. And we're also seeing a breakdown of silos. So we can go to that Arctic slide. This is between issues, this breakdown of silos, as well as between this concept of human versus nature. There's a growing approach amongst younger people to recognize their own lives in the context of an ecosystem. In the Arctic, which is the fastest warming part of the world, we followed young people who are relearning traditional hunting techniques and doing climate science at the same time. This return to an indigenous understanding of the connections between humans and ecosystems was something, though, that we saw all over the world where we reported. And one of the things that I run into as a journalist covering climate change is that those two words together, climate change, can be kind of nebulous. They entail almost everything. And they can be described as business or education or food or political change. And this was true in Bangladesh here in particular, where issues such as girls' rights and sanitation are tied directly to climate change. But so are also more traditional storylines about disaster warning systems and migration. There's also another takeaway that we had is that there really is a shift of power to the global South. There's a lot of talk about vulnerability and inequities, which is important, but we're also seeing leadership and solutions coming from coming from the South. This is true when it comes to activism, like what we saw in Namibia here. We followed a climate activist who was engaging his community and also bringing that information to large international gatherings. But it also is true in innovation. Finally, we saw a shifting in what young people see as progress. This is particularly true in a story I reported from Portugal about people who had returned to rural areas to farm in a climate-friendly way. They talked a lot about agriculture and global warming, but they were really focused on new ways of living and challenging this idea of perpetual growth and consumption. And so I want to acknowledge that there is probably a lot of discouragement right now amongst people who are focused on climate change. There's potentially a lot of fear as well. There's a lot happening on a higher political level, threats to climate research and climate activism. But if there's anything that our reporting taught us, it's also that there is a lot of energy and hope and innovation in this space that's happening regardless of top-down policies. And that's not to say that what happens on a policy and economic-wide level doesn't matter. It really does. And that the young people will fix this approach is not helpful for a lot of reasons I suspect we'll get into. But there is a lot of ground up creativity in this transition. And I see a lot of my job as a journalist in this space is to help recognize and then also share it. Um, I will turn this over to Rebecca to talk more, but I'd be really happy to continue the conversation about what it means to be writing about this massively broad topic at this point in time. So thank you.
It's wonderful to see all those photos, and it's such a great segue actually, where you ended in terms of young people are expected to fix this problem, which to me that expectation is part of the burden that this climate generation faces. And I just want to sort of very briefly introduce myself that that I was a clinician and a social activist for the better part of my adult life. And I had prided myself on being somebody who could look at hard truths, who could talk difficult truths about capitalism, about racism. I imagined myself to be one of those kinds of leaders. And I was also completely and utterly terrified to talk about climate change. And I, in many respects, counted myself as one who dismissed it because I could not handle the implications of it. And I would get gifts upon gifts upon gifts from my father, who was focused on it. And those gifts would land at the bottom of my bookshelves, or they would land far away someplace that I would never read. And it became really obvious to me that the biggest thing confronting me on this issue in my world was my own anxiety, my own anxiety, my own fear, my own overwhelm, the difficulty to handle something so massive, and feeling so tiny around it. And I felt like if that was affecting me, who actually prided themselves on being the opposite of that kind of persona, I could only imagine that that was endemic. And so I made a commitment actually after going to an event in Missoula, where Grace and I are both from originally. And in that event, I found in community with a lot of other people, which is key to this, in fact. I found the courage to start looking at the issue of climate change and have never looked back. And in that regard, I joined an organization and then have now started leading an organization called the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. And in that process and during that time, literally witnessed the term climate anxiety being very, very much on the fringe of the newspaper world and not talked about at all. There was this one researcher named Renee Lertzman who somehow broke through the void and got it through, all the way to the point where you could not open a newspaper or look at an article anywhere without the words climate anxiety being everywhere. And so that's been an incredible sea change actually in the last 5 years, really tremendous sea change. And in many, many respects, I think that's an extraordinary growth. It is a way of which we can talk about climate change, not simply in technical terms and not simply in sort of scientific terms, but the ways it starts impacting our sense of self, our sense of capacity, our futures. It was a way of human beings starting to be involved, both in the source of the problem or feelings and how we're feeling, but also as the solution in terms of who we are as people, what we bring as people to this problem. So it was an amazing shift that was really quite important. And I want to sort of go into some of the hallmarks of what climate anxiety looks like, because I will then talk a little bit about where I think we're headed in a kind of problematic way around that term. The notable things that we think about when we think about climate anxiety from any perspective, from any person, it doesn't matter whether they're youth, it doesn't matter if they're adults. It is these are the sort of the key aspects of what climate anxiety is about, that it includes intolerable levels of uncertainty about our future, about our capacities to meet the future, about resources, existential resources and concrete resources, financial, food, et cetera, et cetera. It's about looking at a future far more unknown and bleak than people had hoped in their world experience. It has earned distrust in institutions. I say that regardless of where people are on the political spectrum, that it includes profoundly a feeling the institutions that are meant to be taking care of these issues are completely missing the boat and ignoring it, or in fact, making it worse. And that's a key part of what climate anxiety is about. It's not just the experience of climate, the failure to act on it by responsible institutions, or even those institutions making it worse. There's also the sense of lost opportunities for oneself or for loved ones, whether that's an opportunity emotionally, an opportunity in our futures, opportunities as a career, opportunities in terms of a long life, all sorts of different ways in which we imagine opportunities for our lives, for our loved ones. It also includes a lost sense of identity for ourself and our loved ones. You think about farmers who are having to give up their farm. You're thinking about lobster fishermen who are having to give up their sort of lobsters. You think about youth who are figuring out, do I need to go to college? What are my options? A lost sense of identity about who they are, how they belong in their world. And finally, of course, a lost landscape. Again, that can be both emotional and literal. How we ground ourselves in the world, how we see our world, how we participate with our bodies in the world, in the landscapes we live in, where our memories reside, where our sense of childhood resides, where all of our feelings of memory that become part of our own sense of being on this earth reside. All of those things are key aspects of climate anxiety. And the reason I bring those together is because that is not just for youth. And it is not just associated, as it's come to be, with one end of the political spectrum. Historically and recently, it has gotten labeled very much and dismissed as being on the left. That's for woke people to feel like that when it's articulated in a certain way. But in fact, this also applies to frontline responders of all kinds, and even in very, very conservative areas. All of these things, every single aspect of what I've just described, are key features among huge numbers of populations that think of themselves in very politically disparate ways, which I think is really quite problematic. And we can go on to the next. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, thanks. So I bring this up because it's really important to emphasize as we try to unburden youth, who are not actually the only ones responsible for solving this problem, is that the majority of people in the United States actually care about climate change, again, across political spectrums, if we talk about it in more complex ways. And the majority worry about it for all of the right reasons, for future generations, not just the kind of nickel and diming worry about what's happening with their resources in a very narrow way, but deep sense of commitment to the future of their generations. These are huge, huge feelings. Again, regardless of political spectrum, it's a matter of how we talk about it. And yet the majority of people don't talk about it for so many different reasons. And we can go into that, I think, in the breakout rooms. Why don't people talk about it? But because they don't, the majority also underestimate how many other people care. And that generates a false sense that they are the only ones who care. And that also perpetuates a sense of collective self-silencing and isolated suffering. And all of that ultimately makes it feel like there's a whole apathetic world out there when it's really quite the opposite. And so we can go on to the last one. So I'm going to end here because this is so much what I've been learning as I've been exploring the whole field, is that the very powerful frame of climate anxiety has started to actually narrow who we can talk to. I think it's become problematic in this particular political experience. I think it exists, but it ends up getting linked too much to the language of protest in a very specific way, and it makes it unrecognizable to people who otherwise actually feel profoundly the very same things that other people feel. And I'll use as an example from a state that I've come to know and love, that 75% of Montana farmers and ranchers believe that climate change is impacting their business and driving high levels of stress and anxiety, and are contributing to escalating, if not sort of record levels of suicide rates in Montana. And these are among farmers and ranchers, a red state. So the question is, how do we connect ourselves to these issues when it's parents agricultural workers, teachers, of course, young people, elderly people, climate scientists, climate journalists, the frontline workers. People who are experiencing these fears are getting wider and wider as the crisis intensifies, which means that we have the obligation to figure out how to connect to those other populations, to those other generations, so that it's not simply on youth. And to me, that's actually one of the most important things, is about thinking about it in terms of solidarity and how the youth are part of, but absolutely not responsible for solving this problem. And I will eagerly take part in conversations about this. And I'm so excited to hear Grace.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. I will give just a brief introduction. First of all, I've had the pleasure of crossing paths with Stephanie and Rebecca both in the past in different contexts, so that's wonderful to see them again. And they've covered a lot of what I wanted to say, actually, which doesn't happen to me often. But I will say they are, professionals in this field in their own respective ways. Whereas I think I serve as the example for their work. And so, I am I'm 21. I'm a rising senior in college. I've been involved in climate work in various ways for 6 or 7 years now. 7. Oh, I'm getting old. Still regularly navigating both climate action and also how to articulate my experiences as a young person growing up in this context. What that work has looked like for me, just to give some background, the maybe the biggest chunk of my work so far has been as a plaintiff in the constitutional climate lawsuit held versus state of Montana, which was about a 5-year process ending this past December, where we sued the state of Montana over their contributions to climate change and thus to violating our rights as Montana youth to a clean and healthful environment, to life, to liberty, to property, all of those lovely constitutional rights that we're so lucky to have. And we won first in district court and then at the Montana Supreme Court. I'm also, as of very recently, a plaintiff in a new lawsuit. Surprise, people who didn't, everyone on the panel who didn't know that, which is called Lighthizer versus Trump. And it is challenging several of the administration's executive orders that promote fossil fuels in their own ways. So feel free to Google it if you'd like more information, and I can send some around. But the context here is that, I have been a part of these two actions in particular and some others that are very much centered on the concept of youth. They are youth climate cases. And I was one of 16 youth plaintiffs, all under the age of 18 when we filed our case. And so as a young person, and this has obviously been articulated already, but it's really hard to remember that this is not just all our job. And that's one of the things that I've been struggling against for years is trying to balance my own the really intense emotions of wanting to be involved and trying to figure out how to maximize the efficacy of my engagement, while also feeling such frustration and anger that I have to be involved in this at all. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg as far as the emotions go. But it does make events like often webinars kind of a challenging emotional experience because they often attract youth. And my question is, why am I speaking to the youth? I don't think that's necessarily the demographic that at least I want to engage, because I have a strong belief that it is still not the youth's duty to be, solving this problem. There are still several decades left before my generation is really at the pinnacle of our power and positions of power. And so I think I appreciate all of you. I've heard we have a very kind of diverse group of adults, if you will, and practitioners in your various ways that are here to learn about how to engage with youth in your own capacities. And I appreciate that awareness, because it is your generations that we need more engagement from. And just I wanted to kind of touch on a few principles of that engagement, but I'll save some for the breakouts and Q&A later. The first is just kind of the complexity of what those climate anxiety emotions actually look like. I very much agree with Rebecca, and you articulated it very well in a way that I haven't heard before, but just that is such an oversimplification. For me, those emotions have looked a lot like guilt about pursuing interests other than climate work, when I have such a constant awareness of impending doom. It's hard to do other things. It can be loss of freedom of giving up those other pursuits, frustration about how every avenue of action feels, when you look closer, like a dead end, and just kind of the feeling trapped in that. So it can look so many ways. The best antidote to that range of emotions that my generation feels is, I think, the actions of the generations above us, and the good changes that they make sometimes, and when they are making progress. The second best antidote, I think, is learning how to do it yourself. And by yourself, I mean my generation. And so the learning process of what does effective engagement look like seriously, what needs to happen, what roles are not being filled. And that's one of the things that I want to encourage you all to do, is in encouraging or involving youth to teach those skills of actual critical thinking about what needs to be happening, because I think we as youth, with our lack of life experience and our kind of limited exposure to the world, have a much harder time than adults actually piecing together avenues of action. So we can become very much limited to social media engagement and school strikes and the things that we see, and we don't have nearly as comprehensive of an understanding of what is out there. I got very lucky in being a part of a lawsuit, which is not a normal endeavor for a 16-year-old, and I think if there's more support from adults in guiding youth towards engagement with these institutions that actually do control climate change, then I think that would be a very effective way of involving the youth in a way that doesn't feel as burdensome or as futile. So I really appreciate you all being here, and I'm looking forward to seeing how these conversations develop.
Great. Thank you guys so much. Those were fabulous intros, and I've already learned so much. And now we're going to move on to the breakout portion of this event. So I think if we go to the next slide, maybe we have some questions here for you guys to discuss in your breakout rooms. Obviously, you can talk about whatever is on your mind. You are not limited to these questions, but it's just something to get the conversation started while you're in these rooms. I am about to open those right now. All right, hi. So now we'll begin the Q&A portion of our evening. We have about, I think, 30 minutes probably until we'll wrap up. So, I want to start the floor by just asking folks how that conversation went. Were there any major takeaways? Did you guys find any common themes? I know we mentioned that a lot of you were coming from different backgrounds, and I know in the group I was in, we were in different countries even. So I am curious to hear if there were any common threads or any takeaways from some of those groups. Or any questions for our panelists. If anyone wants to raise their hand and just kick off the Q&A section, please go ahead. You also don't have to come off mute if you're not in a good place for that. You can also put your comments in the chat. That's open as well, and I will be moderating for that. Emily, please.
Hi, everyone. As I was telling my group mates, I'm surrounded by boxes and piles of laundry, so I'm going to stay off video because I'm moving. But one question that we were talking about at the end is what do you all take to be the climate generation, and how do you put bookends on that? And is that helpful?
I'll jump in here for the climate generation just because in some ways that's our fault from our headline and our project. You know, when we were starting the story, we were trying to figure out how to narrow it. Like, who are we going to look at? How do we decide to include some people in this cohort and some people not? And we ended up deciding the reason why we picked this particular section of humans was that in 1989, you had the codification of United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child. So it was sort of one marker of the starts of this new generation that understood internationally that children were a thing and had their own set of rights. And at the same time, that same year or around there was also when the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere passed what people thought was scientists say was a sustainable level to avoid atmospheric disruption. So those were, you know, in some ways, I will admit that they were kind of narrative tools, but it was one way for us to put bookends of it. And what I always say is, actually, this was from a conversation that I had with Grace. We also realized that that's the Taylor Swift generation. So that was the other way we could define it. So, you know. It is definitely, we can, obviously this issue goes well beyond that.
Thank you.
I would like to know from the people here the effects that you think Greta Thunberg, or the common name Greta Thunberg, her effects on climate science and climate anxiety.
I wanted to go back just for, I don't know if this will get to the Greta Thunberg, but I wanted to just say something about the climate generation that I think is incredibly important. It is that it refers to the first generation who has never known not to be living in a space of catastrophic dread about the climate, which does not mean it's the only catastrophic dread that people have experienced in the world, but it's the first generation where they've never known something other than this kind of dread. And for some people, that means it's a level of normalization that makes it impossible to grasp. For other people, it's a level of anxiety that they've lived in and internalized. And so when I think about what Grace was saying is how do we pursue something else when we know it's this constant in our lives? I think this is Grace's first generation that has had to deal with that. And I think that that's really quite profound. And it does give rise to me to very unique kinds of suffering and unique kinds of attention that warrant care and consideration and responsibility, honestly, not by them, but on behalf of them by others.
Ivan, do you have a response or a question?
It's a bit of a response to John. Actually, well, I think Greta had a huge influence. I live in Nova Scotia, Canada, on the eastern coast. Big influence on myself, on my youngest daughter especially. I was doing a lot of activist work then in a small town I was living in, and had a huge impact on high school students. And just to give you an example, my daughter was in first year of university then, or second year, sorry, and she's in Montreal, which is about a 15-hour drive from where I live. So I went, and we went to, Greta Thunberg was invited in Montreal, which is my home city. There were 500,000 people in the demonstration. And that movement was, of course, with the pandemic, but it was, yeah, I don't know about other people, but for my part of the world, and certainly my family and myself personally, a great, very positive influence.
If I can add to that as well, I think I was either a freshman or a sophomore in high school when Greta's work became so well known. And I never took part in the demonstrations and well, here and there, but not really in a big way. But what I remember being most impactful about her work is that she gave voice to some of the more complex emotions that come with being a part of this generation. Particularly, you all might remember her speech at the UN, the How Dare You speech. And I think it was she just said it very clearly and plainly, and was able to articulate the responsibility of older generations in a way that kind of crystallized it for me, because before that um I had so much anxiety and fear, but I hadn't yet been able to conceptualize it in terms of responsibility. And so I think that was what was so impactful about her influence. The flip side of that, I think, is that because so many folks in my generation were first exposed to climate work through Greta and through Fridays for Future, the strikes that they were doing, I think, and this kind of goes back to something I said at the beginning, but I think it kind of limited our perception of what um, protest looks like and what action looks like. Um, and it's combined with social media, which has compounded a lot of this, I think. But because think like when you are growing up, what you're educated about, at least in the American school system, is um, you see the civil rights movement and the marches there. You see that's pretty much probably the biggest thing that you learn about in terms of civil movement. And so to be educated about that, and then to see marches as the main form of climate action, it's very powerful and they're very central, but it's not it's, I think, a limiting way to think about action. And I think that was something that took me a long time and a lot of luck in terms of exposure to overcome. And so I would, I guess, challenge you and the people that you all work with and know in your lives to diversify your understanding of what action looks like. Because historically, there's been a lot more than marches. Um, some of it was a little bit more illegal than marches, which is part of the reason it's not taught in school. I'm not suggesting that's what we should be doing, but that there's a whole range of ways, and that kids are able to conceptualize a lot more than we think them able to. So, exposure.
What would you, Grace, what would you like to hear from, or for people, say, that are older, say boomers and those a bit younger, what would you like to see them do?
This is a great question, John. I love when people ask me this question. Well, first, I'd like to point out that we have a lot of boomers in government right now, still, one might
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
And oh God, what a can of worms, John. So if anyone has other thoughts, you're welcome to jump in. But if we're speaking specifically in the US, you know what? Let me back out. I'm not going to get into specific policies because that would take too long.
Sure.
What I would say is we have had numerous opportunities. We as a global community have had opportunities since about the 70s to take fast action on this issue. Everyone knows that. It's a fact. We continue to fail, even now, especially when it comes to international climate policy and the way it interacts with other international relations and how we like the world to view the United States. So it's been compounded and confused by that. I would say that as far as policymakers go, it's as simple as um, do better. And what I mean by that, I think, in large part, is extracting the realities of climate change and climate action from all of these confounding variables, and realizing that climate action does not have to be, and very much should not be, intertwined with partisan politics, because it affects everyone and is not a partisan issue. It should never have been made a partisan issue. And it is, because of the influences of money and other wonderful things that it has become such. And so if we, you know, as citizens, separate from our leaders and how they can address this, if we as citizens can very actively work to make climate nonpartisan, if we can make it a global issue separate from other global issues, I think we often, especially in liberal spaces, have an instinct to combine the climate conversation with other conversations of justice and things that absolutely need to be discussed, but there's a time and a place for that. And I'm not sure that in current political context, that's necessarily a way that's going to create progress. So I think having additional awareness of how we frame these conversations, either like literal conversations or also like national political conversations, and being true to the principle of actual progress, instead of appearances of progress.
How might we support your endeavors in lawsuits? Because I do think they are effective.
Like my generation's endeavors?
Yep. No, my generation, those younger than me, how would you like to see us support your lawsuits? You're involved in a lawsuit, and others in the world are doing lawsuits, but I think lawsuits in the United States are very important right now. So the courts can be helpful, and you know that you've won at the district court and the Supreme Court of your state. How would you like to see people on this panel? How would you like to see us support your lawsuit and other lawsuits?
It's a great question. I'm honestly pretty new to thinking about it in the federal context because I've been a part of a federal lawsuit for about a week, so kind of new to me. I think, well, I have to say, money always helps. My law firm, Our Children's Trust, is a nonprofit law firm. It's free for all of us plaintiffs to be a part of this. They've been supporting me in going to trial and traveling for about 6 years now, so they could use all the help they can get. But also, if you or people you know are specialists in this, and in you know, climate science or climate psychology or all of those things, like, they use experts. It's part of how law works, is bringing in professionals. If you know youth that are interested in this sort of work, they are always looking for plaintiffs. You know, they can't have a lawsuit everywhere, but they're working on, they're constantly doing new things and surprising us in terms of where they bring lawsuits. But kind of on a more kind of general support level for people who don't fall into those categories, I would say cases like the ones that I'm involved in are often so interpreted in the partisan lens, which makes sense. I'm from the basically one liberal town in Montana, and I totally see, I go to a liberal university, I see why people think of me that way. But it's been one of my central goals to articulate to people that the constitutional rights that our case are founded on are not partisan. The values of my state and Montana's conservation goals are not partisan, and they never have been. And so if we are able to frame, and then in the federal context, if we're able to frame these lawsuits as a defense of democracy and due process and regulation and separation of powers and all of these things that are fundamentally American and fundamentally nonpartisan, and if we can really have those conversations, and kind of, you know, ideally shift the national conversation away from partisan interpretation of climate action, because that's, we default to that.
Would you be willing to put in the chat how we might contact your group and where we could send money, as well as participate in any way we can offer?
Of course. They have a wonderful website. I'll drop a link, and I'll let someone else talk because I've been monopolizing. So
Thank you.
I have a question because we've been talking about how we can keep this from, becoming so partisan all the time. And I think that, there are people who would want climate change to be seen as partisan. And I think Rebecca and Stephanie, maybe we've talked about this, but I'd be curious to hear from both of you actually, Stephanie from like a journalist angle and Rebecca from, working in this climate mental health space. How can we keep, I don't know, people, society from kind of siloing this issue, if we have any ideas on that?
I guess, well, a couple things. I happen to think that no matter what we do, if we are challenging the fossil fuel industry, they will find a way to make it partisan. So I don't think it's ultimately within our control to stop that. But I think it's what we do with that fact. And I think we are now currently, and we talked a little bit before this panel started, how we will inevitably have to bring up the current political moment that we're in. That inevitably what we all have in common is the need for democracy and the need to have some say and the right to protest in whatever forms or the right to advocate in whatever forms that is under attack right now quite decisively. And I think in local levels, people feel much more empowered to take action in whatever forms. And that's why I sort of started in the way I did, is that it's not just the left that feels scared about climate, and it's not just the left who's going to come up with solutions about climate. I think I mean, we talk about sort of the right-wing administration. They're not in denial. They say they are. That's why they're pursuing everything that they want in Greenland and Canada, right? They know darn well what's happening. They're just fostering that ideologically. And I think that in local areas, we need to connect with people who are feeling the anxiety, and that is not partisan. It's become languaged in a partisan way. So I find myself thinking a lot about how do we talk about this without even talking about climate right away. I don't want to be patronized and not to use the term, but how do we reach people at the level of what they're afraid in and connect at that place and then show them that they have an interest in democracy, due process, all of the other things. And so in some ways that goes into, we actually want to merge our issue with everybody else's issue, sort of the opposite of what Grace said. And on the other hand, I understand totally that we don't want it to get kind of lumped into every other woke issue. I mean, so it's an interesting dynamic, right? How do we draw attention to the fact that everybody is feeling this and not give in to the kind of very narrow language of it. And so it's a tricky conundrum, I think. I don't think there's easy answers.
I love that you said the language thing, Rebecca, because I spend a lot of time trying to write about climate change without ever using those two words. And I think sometimes, I mean, this is not the only answer, but one answer of how to raise awareness about these issues and give solutions is to find the common ground, and to find issues that do find support in a cross-partisan way. So one example is I just wrote a story about energy policy, and that can be really tough and could certainly be a divisive and issue. Or you can find, or I can find as a journalist, a lot of different conservative groups who are really involved in promoting solar energy as a way towards energy independence. And in that context, whether we call it energy independence or zero emission energy sources for climate reasons, in some ways the effect doesn't actually matter. We're finding these places. I know Grace has talked about her state's heritage of people being outdoors and loving the outdoors and loving natural wild spaces, and finding ways to write about threats to those. Again, for whether it's for people who are hunting or fishing or hiking or preserving, there are because it's an everything issue, there are lots of places where there are ways to find commonalities. And so I think that is not the only step, but I think that is one slice of an answer for how to write about this.
There's something else that Grace said that I think is really interesting, and you were talking about all these other ways to get involved. And again, Rebecca, it reminded me of another conversation we had before this event about imperfect allyship and that idea of, sometimes people are so nervous about how they're going to get involved or feeling like, maybe they don't have like the funds to donate, or maybe they're not doing the right thing and they don't know exactly how to approach it. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to how we could kind of open the space for people to become imperfect allies.
Are you talking to me in particular?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think that is coming up again right now. That if we insist on certain litmus tests for engagement of any kind, we're not gonna win the fight for democracy. I guess I would say quite literally. And I think that anybody who has an interest on some of these issues, I think Stephanie put it right, it doesn't really fully matter what brings somebody to care about an issue. If they are willing to be with you and sort of fight alongside with you, that really, really, really matters. And one of my own part of my own background is that I was part of organizing the Women's March when Trump first got elected. And the thing that was so amazing, and this was in Montana when I lived in Montana, what was so amazing and what was so different from what I had assumed is that there was all walks of life of people very, very invested in coming to protest from any number of different perspectives. And if we insisted on everyone having the same perspective and coming to something, I think we're going to lose our chance to connect and lose our chance to understand other people and lose our chance to sort of build common ground on a number of things. And I think that often ends up coming around on local issues, especially local referendums, whether people are going to be building Amazon stores near where they are, if there's going to be a pipeline where they are, if there's going to be solar where they are, there's going to be so many different issues that people need to find ways to talk about it. And work together and resolve the differences and of sort of what those mean in people's practical lives. And I think that that's the harder work, rather than just being sort of on a soapbox moralizing about climate, but really doing the hard work of building community and across different opinions in local areas. I think it's again, it's not, I don't claim it's easy, but I think when it's done, it's profoundly life-changing for people. And you look at that in sort of North Carolina after the hurricane, the level of the ways in which people's ideas about each other broke down when they were working together around sort of solving some of the issues that came up after the hurricane.
Can I jump in? I said I was going to stop talking, but I have had two somewhat related, fairly concrete things come to mind while you guys were talking. One is they're both very like youth related though, in terms of things that I think are missing in our conversations with youth about climate. One, in terms of what we actually teach our youth, in terms of what making a difference looks like, kind of how I mentioned earlier. I think there is so much space for talking about, especially when people are very young, about kind of local work and building community and the importance of that as a great foundation. And then I think we often in like high school talk about policy and get people kind of thinking about that. But I just want to throw out there, this is kind of maybe an unpopular thing, but that's kind of why I'm throwing it out there, is that we don't often talk about the value of the private sector. Which, as someone who thought I was going to go into the government until about 6 months ago, is a bit is a weird shift for me. But I will just say that, as we all know, fossil fuel companies are what's driving this crisis, and so having an understanding of economics and how that world works and how that, because I hate to say it, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And so being able to use those systems for good, I think is something that people need to learn at every age. And a totally separate thought about including youth in these conversations, and I mentioned this in my breakout room, so sorry to repeat it to you guys, but is that one of my experiences has been that it is very it's pretty commonplace now to include youth in this conversation by creating a program for them or creating a youth advisory board, very popular in both the environment and or like environmental groups and also in the government. And I want to throw out there that that is actually a silo, and you're throwing youth into a separate room to have conversations about this issue. And it, as someone who's been on the receiving end of that, it is very much, it feels like a like performative when it's put in that context, because I don't want a seat at the other table. I want a seat at the table, and I don't want my voice to be just part of the mix. I want it to be heard and implemented, which is a big ask, I know. But it's just something to be aware of, especially for those of you out there running organizations. Sorry, I know that's not at all related to what we're talking about, so I kind of
No, that's
No.
awesome.
I
I think
want
I'm
to.
gonna just piggyback really quickly on like first of all, second, I mean, like first of all, like bravo for that, because it's you see that not just with youth here, but like in all different groups. My background was reporting on conservation issues in sub-Saharan Africa, and like I cannot tell you how many like local advisory panels that were convened so that the people in charge could just do what they wanted to do. But on the first bit, this idea of private sector, I was on a panel not terribly long ago with some educators, and they were talking about how, the education in the climate of young people in about climate change has really focused on the science, like teaching young people what climate change is, what's happening. And as Grace said, when you get to high school, more policy positions. And in some ways, a lot of people already know this. It certainly differs depending on where geographically people are located. But I heard from some educators who were implementing programs to try to bring in people in very different businesses who could talk about what they were doing and how it connected to climate change. So they would bring in somebody who was trying to develop low emission cement, and they would be talking about manufacturing systems and businesses. You would bring in somebody who was involved in climate finance mechanisms in a bank, and that would be a conversation and a workshop with young people. And I think that widening that aperture to and really showing those pathways can help spark that creativity. But as Grace said, like we're talking about young people, like how are young people supposed to know the 72 different jobs in the area that actually deal with climate change on some level? So that's something to also think about, that broadening of what climate action means and how to teach it.
Yeah, I want to jump on that because I think, and this also goes back to some of the things that were earlier said about how do our options get foreshortened because of climate change? And one of the ways that people have been talking about it, and I wrote it in the chat, is that every job can be a climate job. And it's like whatever you are interested in, whether it's music or journalism or writing or science or poli-sci or data, any number of different things. Because climate change affects everything, there is absolutely no limit to what can be done in the context of climate. And so in some ways, I think it's really important, especially in talking to young people who are feeling so sort of corralled into one direction out of their feelings about it, is to try to help open that back up and say that there's enormous possibility to do any number of different things from a climate perspective, and that should not limit what people choose to do in their lives, and that there's many, many ways to be, again, as Grace was saying, taking action on climate change, which is different from being an activist on climate change. It's like, how does one take action? It can happen in all sorts of different ways, in different contexts, and in different fields. And I think it's really important so that people have a sense that they can enjoy their life and engage in the things that interest them, in the mode that they're interested. That's so critical.
Thanks. Arlene, I think you were going to say something.
I think whatever I was going to say is no longer relevant, but I do want to say, Grace, I think you've given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate that. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
If
I
I may,
agree. Plus
um,
one to that. Oh, sorry. I think my computer is delayed. Nick, the floor is yours.
okay. Um, as I mentioned in my breakout group, I'm a retired teacher who still works on curriculum. So I'm in contact with mostly middle school students, and some of the issues that we've dealt with are pretty much based on the science lessons, the alternative to fossil fuels. And when right across the bay, we have oil refineries and all of the issues that are going on right now with this. But so many of our students that I work with, limited English speakers, are brought to us because of climate change and migration. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer before, long ago now, in Micronesia, which is undergoing a lot of changes because of the rise in sea level. And I just looked this up thinking that if I have any impact, it might be more with Micronesia than with the United States. There's one quote that came out of a student at the University of Hawaii who's, as they are losing many of their lower outer islands in Micronesia, she says, who do you become when your heritage, your traditional ties to your homeland and cultural practices are swallowed by the sea? So I'm going to be looking for some groups that are trying to work with climate, maybe back in Micronesia, connecting me with my youth.
I think we have time for one more question. If anyone has a really good one. What is it that I usually say, Michaela? I'm blanking. Spicy, short and spicy. Otherwise, I have one. I always like to finish by just asking people, what is, unless somebody else has one. Sorry, I couldn't tell if somebody came off mute.
I had one more question for Grace.
John, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please.
If you were asked to participate with a group of 10th graders at a high school, how would you interact with them? And what might you talk about, or would you listen to? How might that go?
Putting me on the spot here.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. I think, wait, this is going to be a very kind of meta answer. It's not very implementable necessarily, but I think one of the things that this whole conversation has made me want to explore, and especially explore from the perspective of youth, is kind of the interplay between um, community and local action and how each of us as individuals is tied to this problem. And then separately, the action piece. Because I tend to think that action on climate should be top down. It should be coming from people in power. Should be coming from governments and from corporations and from these people who have so much power to influence our lives. Because I see that as efficient. I'm like, oh, that's the fastest way for these things to happen. Hasn't been the case. So I think is a very kind of roundabout answer to your question, but I'm thinking that some sort of conversation with 10th graders or any population really about how we can bridge that divide between that which binds us and how we create these communities across political the political spectrum and across our different identities and across the world, and how that sort of bottom-up momentum can be used to successfully create top-down action. I think that is the motivating principle often behind protest in like the Fridays for Future movement. Is it's like we have such power and energy as like the youth protest movement. It's so visible, and it feels so much in solidarity with one another, and it feels like it should so clearly convey to policymakers what we want and what we need. But they have so many other influences that it doesn't have as clear of an effect as we want it to. And so thinking about, how can we communicate that better? Maybe that's, through our religious ties, and it's, communicating with a particular policymaker how climate action should resonate with their religion. Or I'm not gonna be able to come up with more creative examples on the spot, but having a conversation with high schoolers about, what does our community building look like for climate? What does our action look like? And then how do we make that a big system that feeds into each other? It's not a great curriculum necessarily. Don't have a lesson plan for you yet, but maybe get back to me. So I'll see what I can come up with.
Thank you.
All right. And that means we are right about at time. So thank you to our panelists. You all did such a great job. And thank you all to everyone who stayed with us this time and participated and everything. Also, thank you, Michaela, for sharing your screen amidst my computer troubles. We really appreciate you all joining us today. And finally, we do have a survey after you sign out. We really appreciate you taking the time to help us improve our events. This is a new format for us at the Pulitzer Center, so if you liked the breakout rooms, let us know. If you didn't, let us know that too, because we are always open to adjusting and trying new things. And yes, thank you again. And Grace, Rebecca, Stephanie, we really appreciate you all sharing your time and insights with us. Bye for now.
Thank you for hosting this. It's been wonderful.